Good day, everyone. Today we have Jeremy Bentham's an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. We are going into chapters 1 to 4. Chapter 1, the principle of utility. Chapter 2, principles opposing the principle of utility. Chapter 3, the four sanctions or sources of pain and pleasure. And Chapter 4, measuring pleasure and pain. Now let's get to know who Bentham is. Jeremy Bentham was born on February 15, 1748 in Houndsditch, London. He was an English philosopher, jurist, political reformer, and the founder of modern utilitarianism. In 1776, he introduced himself as a supporter of utility as the fundamental principle of behavior and law in A Fragment on Government. And later on, he published an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, which we will be discussing.
And this chapter 1 is all about the principle of utility. Nature has placed mankind under the governments of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They point out what we ought to do as well as determine what we shall do. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. It is not a subjective choice to base moral behavior on perceptions of pleasure and pain, but that we are compelled to do so. Those or some of those are some excerpts from the written work of Jeremy Bentham, and it basically talks about humans are fundamentally driven by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. He stated that these two factors are the main influencers of human behavior. Essentially, we do things because they bring us pleasure or help us avoid pain. This is why in the PowerPoint we can see here, I've written here that it carries the standard of right and wrong, such as this is because, as stated a while ago, Jeremy Bentham said that we are driven to our actions are basically driven from the pleasure and pain, these two concepts. And also another is that it governs the people's choice, which is again, since this is the reason why we do things and we think on how we act on things, it basically governs how or what we do or what we think. Now this brings up to the concept of principle of utility. The principle of utility recognizes the subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system. This principle approves or disapproves of every action. It also controls the quote-unquote happiness. And lastly, it focuses on the interest or happiness of the community itself, not just one solely individual. Basically, sinasabi ng principle of utility na one is siya yung nag-approve or siya yung nag-disapprove ng mga ginagawa ng mga tao. Kasi as stated as before kanina, may dalawang sovereign na nag-lead sa atin gumagawa ng mga choices natin or nag-lead sa atin gumawa ng mga choices, which is the pleasure and pain or the happiness or sadness or, you know, pero yeah, sabi ni Bentham na yun nga, yun yung nag-lead sa atin sa mga, nag-derive sa atin, nag-urge sa atin gumawa ng mga choices natin. Yun yung mga reason natin kung bakit ginagawa natin yung ginagawa natin. I hope that makes sense. Yun nga, sabi nga dito, it approves and disapproves. Basically, yun nga, ina-approve niya or disapprove kung ano ba yung morally right na ginagawa, kung tama ba yung ginagawa o hindi. Again, it controls the happiness. Bakit niya kinokontrol? Because again, if you would go back, sinabi nga na nag-lead sa atin gumawa ng mga different kinds of actions is the pleasure and pain. And more pleasure, obviously, it brings us more happiness. And pain, syempre, we try to negate that or tinatry natin iwasan yun kasi syempre ayaw natin nun. And yun nga, so in that certain concept, parang napapansin mo, it kind of controls the happiness of a person. Right? And lastly is, it focuses on the interest or the happiness of a community. Sinasabi nga lang niya na, yun nga, community as a whole consists of individuals, which is isa-isa. And these individuals have their own, syempre, interest and happiness, which what brings this to one unity of interest or happiness, which is yung pagkakaisa ng mga tao in terms of their same interest or likehood. But yeah, okay. Moving on to ano nga ba yung term na utility or para kay Bentham, ano nga ba yung utility? As stated here, utility is the property of any object to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happenings of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. He defines utility as the ability of something to produce benefit, pleasure, or happiness, or to prevent harm or pain. This is kind of very easy to understand as long as you try to go delve into it. Basically, sinasabi lang niya dito na ginagamit yung utility na term is kung yung bagay or yung action na ginagawa ng isang tao para mag-produce or maging happy or magkaroon siya ng benefit or the pleasure na sinasabi nga. Basically, sinasabi ko dito is, abang ginagawa niya yun is, syempre, minimize niya na rin yung pain and mischief or evil or, negative things or negative thoughts. Or kaya yun mismo yung ginagawa niyang action, baka hindi nga good, pero yung ginagawa niyang action is, para lang talaga ma-prevent yung harm or yung pain, sinasabi. So, ayun, basically yun yung term ng utility na sinasabi ni Bentham. Moving on, Now, the interest of the community is one of the most general expressions that can occur in the phraseology of morals. A community is a fictitious body composed of the individual persons who are considered as constituting, as it were, its members. The interest of the community is the sum of the interests of the several members who compose it. It is in vain to talk of the interest of the community without understanding what is the interest of the individual. Bentham emphasizes that the interest of the community is just the sum of the interests of its individual members. Therefore, what benefit individuals ultimately benefit society as a whole. I also want to uh, give context. Itong mga nilagay ko dito are directly from the excerpts ni Bentham. So, siguro in some way medyo naguguluhan kayo. But basically, may konting points na sinasabi dito si Bentham. Una is yung community, kung ano yung term ng community para sa context niya. Now, community daw it is a concept na isang grupo ng mga individual ng mga tao, or ewan ko kung anong concept or anong tinutukoy niya, but for me, isang community na merong binubuo ng individual ng mga tao. Itong mga individual na tao, syempre, may mga sarili silang mga interest, right? Syempre, ikaw meron ng interest, meron din ikaw interest, and we're in a one community. Basically, kung ano yung nagbe-benefit sa akin, nagbe-benefit din sa lahat, as long as, tugma yung mga interest natin, syempre as a community nga, di ba? Another point na pinopoint out dito ni Bentham is that when we're talking about the interest of the community, hindi pwede nating i-disregard yung interest ng individual or yung mga individual. Siyempre, kasi sila nga yung bumubuo ng community. For example, we're in a group of friends, like tayo, magkakaibigan tayo, and we went to a restaurant. Tapos, sabi ko na, ay gusto ko ng pansit. Tapos, ako lang yung, hindi pwedeng hindi natin pakinggan yung other opinions or ano yung gusto ng ibang tao. Kasi alam ka namang sa restaurant, syempre ako yung nagsabi, so dapat pansit lang ba yung kakainin natin kasi ako yung nagsabi, ba hindi. So ayun, what I'm trying to say here is that we should always take into consideration or i-acknowledge natin yung interest ng each individual na within the community, syempre. Next is the quote-unquote the law of utility. As stated, when conformable, it may be convenient to imagine a kind of law or dictate called law or dictate of utility. In a sense, an action being conformable to such law or dictate. Dito sinasabi lang naman na pag itong mga actions natin or yung sinasabi ko kanina, lahat to or when conformable to the principle of utility, we could say it as the law of utility. As si Bentham nagsabi nito, parang yun yung pinopoint out lang niya. Now, of an action conformable to the principle of utility, one may always say either that the action is one that ought to be done or at least it is not one that ought to be done. So, medyo nakakalito to, pero sinasabi lang yan na dapat natin gawin or dapat di natin gawin if ito nag-confirm ito sa law of utility. Yun yung basically pinopoint out lang niya. We're in an action conform to the principle of utility when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. Parang pinopoint out lang dito na an action conforms to the principle of utility. Na-confirm lang yung isang action sa principle ng utility pag meron siyang or yung ginagawa niya is nakakapagbigay much more happiness sa community than ipinapahina niya to. So, more happiness, konti lang yung niya, nabibigyan niyang negative or pain. Next is man contradicting the principle. On most occasions of their lives, men in general embrace this principle without thinking of it. When a man attempts to combat the principle of utility, it is with reasons drawn without being aware of it from the principle itself. His arguments do not prove that the principle is wrong rather than it is misapplied. So, yung mga taong daw nag-contradict or basically parang tinatry na hindi inatake yung principle of utility, yung mga reasons nila or yung reasons kung bakit ganun yung nangyayari sa kanila is either hindi sila educated or probably it is misapplied, as sabi nga dyan directly ni Bentham. And another sinabi dito ni Bentham is that yung mga reasons daw nila or yung ginagawa nila are even directly drawn from the principle itself, which is the principle of utility. Doon daw nanggaling or doon nag-root yung mga reasons nila, which is kinda, already tells us kung ano yung standing nila, kumbaga. Sinabi rin dito ni Bentham sa first line nga dyan is that on most occasions of their lives, yung tayong mga tao daw is in general innate na daw or subconsciously natin na ginagawa yung principle of utility, like already given na siya, hindi natin siya kailangan pag-aralan, ganun. So eto, sabi ni Bentham na when a man disagrees with the principle, he should have a reason drawn from the principle itself, as said na kanina. And etong mga list na to or steps na sinabi ni Bentham, one, sabi niya na will you discard the principle altogether? Now, what do you all your reasonings amount to? Will you judge and act without any principle or with another focus? Now, is your sentiment a standard of right or wrong? Right and wrong. How far will you adopt it? How will you justify yourself about adopting it so far? Why not embrace it any further? Ito yung mga basically steps or questions ni Bentham na gusto niyang sabihin sa mga taong nakikipag argue or sinasabi na yun nga, yung about dun sa principle of utility na hindi daw totoo yun or hindi tama. And ayun, sabi niya na whatever the argument is, it does not mean that the principle is wrong, but rather misapplied daw. Since reasons ng mga taong to is basically rooted or directly from the principle itself. So medyo umiikot lang siya. So moving on to the next chapter, which is the chapter 2 that is entitled as the principles opposing the principle of utility, na kung saan dito sinasabi ni Bentham yung mga other principles na parang kumakalaban sa principle na utility and tinatry niyang i-refute yung mga principles na ito. Now firstly is the principles of asceticism. A supporter of this principle says that I ought to do that act which will bring about the least happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of persons. So, sa madaling salita, ito yung principle na literal na kabaliktaran ng principle of utility. Kasi doon, tinatry nilang ma-achieve yung mga greater good or pleasure or happiness for the greater number. Pero sa principle of asceticism, as stated by the book, they would want the least happiness for the greatest number. Basically, gusto nila ng pain at ayaw nila sa happiness. So, is an example of this is a person who is masochist? Well, not really. Kasi yung principle of asceticism is not just about physical pain or emotional but the negative experience in general. Kasi pinaniniwala nila na ang pain ay good at bad daw yung pleasure in general. For example, like kunwari, gusto mo kumain sa McDo. Kaso bagsak ka sa exam, so you tend to not buy sa McDo kasi feel mo, di mo siya deserve. So, itong principle na ito is embraced by two classification of men, which are the moralist and the religionist. Yung mga moralists, they are motivated by hope or the prospect of pleasure, wherein they have hope of honor and reputation of the hands of men. And they make a matter of indifference. They are usually yung mga men of education kasi yung principle na ito is aligned or suited in some form or another dun sa goals nila sa buhay. Yung mga religionists naman, ito yung mga taong motivated by fear or the prospect of pain. They are driven by the fear of punished from a vengeful deity or yung nakakataas sa kanila, and they made it a matter of merit of the duty to court pain. Yung example na sinabi ni Bentham sa mga taong ito is yung mga Buddhist monks na kung saan pinaniniwalaan nila yung mga material na bagay or yung social status in general ay nagli-lead lang daw ito into negative things such as pagiging sakim daw ng mga tao or overindulgence, or in general, suffering daw ng mga tao. Kaya if binase natin yung happiness daw natin sa mga gantong bagay, wala daw madudulot na magandang bagay. Kaya pinaniniwala ng mga monks na masama daw yung pleasure kasi if it would all just lead to pain. Kaya ang ginagawa nila is dinedeprive nila yung mga sarili nila sa pleasure through fasting and almsgiving. Para sa kanila, yung aim talaga nila is makakuha ng pleasure in other ways, which is moving on to a afterlife at makarating sa nirvana. Pero sabi ni Bentham, principle of utility lang yon na misapplied. Kasi kung titignan daw, aim pa rin nila is pleasure over pain. Pero in a different matter or context lang nila niligay, which is for them, yung pag-reach nga nila sa nirvana. Now, sabi ni Bentham, itong dalawang classification na to, despite their differences, is nakakabuo ng somewhat unity due to the similarities that they have in terms of pag-hate or pag-iwas sa pleasure. Which Bentham stated na common enemy daw nila, which is yung mga sumusuporta sa principle of utility. Itong mga taong to, as stated by Bentham, is tinatawag na Epicureans. Another principle na nag-adverse sa principle of utility is yung principle of sympathy and antipathy, which is defined as the occasional opposition to the principle of utility. In simpler terms, sinasabi lang ng principle na to na nakabase yung good or bad dun sa nararamdaman natin. For example, we try to look into an action and we ask if gusto ba natin yung action na yun or hindi. If gusto natin yung action na yun, mabuti siya. If di natin gusto, masama naman. As we could see, hindi ito magandang basis for morals and legislations kasi very subjective siya. So this leads to clarification kung ano ba talaga yung tama o mali. And it makes criminal punishment arbitrary and unjust since ayun nga, very subjective at nakabase lang yung decision natin kung ano yung nafe-feel natin about this certain action. So lastly, yung theological principle. Sabi ni Bentham, itong principle na to is hindi talaga principle kasi nanggaling lang talaga siya sa iba't ibang other concepts or iba't ibang principle na nabanggit na natin. Basically, ito yung principle na nakabase ang moral sa will of God. Itong will of God is hindi yung makikita natin sa mga sacred books kasi maraming interpretation yung mga sacred books at hindi natin alam alin yung tama sa mga ito kung wala tayong prior idea na pwede natin siyang i-compare. This also includes yung concept ng pleasure and pain, since if you believe in God and you believe na God wants you to do good, which makes us say na God thinks that there are actions that are good and bad, kakabahan ka or matatakot ka na gumawa ng masamang bagay sa paningin ni God. And itong takot na to or kaba gives us pain. And kung papansinin natin, principle of utility lang din to kasi tinatry natin gumawa ng mabuting bagay para maiwasan yung pain na pwede nating maramdaman. Ito yung, for example, yung donate tayo through charity or tutulong tayo from the needy to the needy kasi yun nga, takot tayo na magalit si God sa atin. And ayun, basically, principle of utility lang din siya. Dito makikita natin na sabi ni Bentham na yung principle of utility is na misapplied lang. Another is when we think that God is a vengeful God or yung gusto lang ni God is ma-experience natin is pain at suffering. Then hindi ba principle of asceticism lang din yon? And lastly, if you think that God is basing right or wrong sa kung ano yung na-feel niya or ano yung nararamdaman niya na kung ano ba yung tama or mali para sa kanya, hindi ba principle of sympathy and antipathy yon since binibase niya yung tama o mali sa kung ano yung nararamdaman niya. So, next chapter, it would be discussed by Jaleel Mata. So, Jaleel.
Thank you, Zen. Now let's dive into Chapter 3, which is the 4 sanctions or sources of pain and pleasure. According to Bentham, legislators should solely seek the happiness of their constituents, and as the law impacts how individuals behave, the legislator should conform to the same standard. Pleasure and pain comes from 4 main places: physical sanction, political sanction, moral sanction, and religious sanction. These sources can influence people's behavior and decisions, therefore being called sanctions. First is the physical sanction. It is the pleasure or pain caused by natural events in daily life, unaffected by any intentional human or supernatural interference. This includes physical injuries, diseases, and natural calamities. Next, we have the political sanction. It is the pleasure or pain imposed by certain persons or organizations within a society who have been authorized by those in authority to impose consequences. These repercussions are typically associated with state laws or regulations such as fines, imprisonment, or other legal punishments. The moral sanction, or the so-called popular sanction. It is the pleasure or pain caused by interactions with other members of society based on personal relationships or subjective judgments rather than official rules. This includes social approval or disapproval, praise or criticism, acceptance or rejection, all depending on one's actions or personality. Lastly, we have the religious sanction. It is the pleasure or pain caused directly by the acts or will of a superior invisible being, such as a god or divine entity, either in this life or in the future one. This includes rewards or punishments attributed to religious authority as well as supernatural intervention based on religious beliefs or moral codes. Now, let's give an example for physical sanction. Doon sa nangyaring pagputok ng bulkang Pinatubo, ang mga naapektuhan nito is yung mga nakatira sa Pampanga, Tarlac, and Zambales. Hundreds of people died and thousands naman became homeless. And syempre, there are those na nagsuffer from diseases and injuries. This happened kasi nasa nature naman ng volcanoes ang mag-erupt, which is a disaster naman for us. Next is for the political sanction. Kunwari ako, nagdadrive ako sa NLEX and ang speed limit doon is 100 lang. Since sobrang luwag ng daan and gusto ko na makapunta sa pupuntahan ko is umarangkada ako ng 130 kilometers per hour. And ang ending, may nakabantay pala na enforcer. So, natikita na ko. Dahil nga brinake ko yung naka-impose na speed limit and syempre yung law. Sa moral sanction naman, for example, sa group of friends mo, nagkakwento ka about sa life mo and nag-a-add ka ng mga lies para lang maganda pakinggan yung story mo. Kaso, nalaman nila after ilang days na nagsisinungaling ka pala. This will make them lose their trust for you and make you ashamed. And lastly, for the religious sanction, according to religious beliefs, we are promised salvation if we lead a virtuous life, and eternal damnation naman for committing sins by the divine judgment of a superior entity such as God. So pleasures and sorrows from physical, political, or moral origins are normally encountered in this lifetime. However, those from religious beliefs might extend up to the future one. These sensations are all part of human nature and can come from any of these sources, with no intrinsic distinctions between the joys and sorrows they produce. And here we are with Chapter 4, Measuring Pleasure and Pain. Kung maaalala natin, Bentham contends that the primary objective of laws should be to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. Thus, pleasure and pain are the fundamental factors to consider when establishing laws or moral judgments. Additionally, we need to understand their force. That is value. So, paano nga ba natin mame-measure ito? Bentham identifies several factors that influence the value of pleasure and pain. First is intensity, or how strong the pleasure or pain is. For example, kinakain mo yung favorite dessert mo after a long day. Magbibigay siya ng pleasure sa'yo, lalo na kung ang tagal mo na siyang kinikrave. On the other hand, breaking a bone can cause intense pain due to the severity of the injury. Next is, we have duration, or how long the pleasure or pain lasts. For example, spending time with your person may bring pleasure throughout the date kasi nabibigyan ka ng happiness and enjoyment. Conversely, pag may toothache ka, it can cause prolonged pain that lasts for days until matreat siya ng dentist mo. Certainty or uncertainty, it is how sure we are that the pleasure or pain will happen. Kunwari, may ticket ka, so sure ka na makaka-experience ka ng pleasure, lalo na kung pinapakinggan mo yung favorite band mo. However, if you're waiting to hear back from a job interview, may uncertainty din eh. So, the uncertainty of whether you'll get the job can lead to anxiety and distress. Next, we have nearness or remoteness. It is how soon the pleasure or pain will occur. For example, winning a prize in a contest you entered recently would bring immediate pleasure since it's happening soon after you participated. In contrast, saving money for retirement might not bring immediate pleasure, but it will provide security and comfort in the distant future. Next, we have fecundity, the likelihood that the pleasure or pain will be followed by similar sensations. For example, if you start watching one episode, there's a high likelihood that you will want to watch another episode, and then another. The pleasure of watching the show is likely to lead to similar sensations of enjoyment as you continue watching more episodes. Then we have purity. It is the likelihood that the pleasure or pain will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind. Following the example for fecundity, there's also a risk that the pleasure of watching the show might be followed by sensations of the opposite kind, such as feeling tired, groggy, or even guilty for staying up too late. This would reduce the purity of the pleasure as it's not purely positive and may be accompanied by negative feelings afterward. Now we have 6 factors altogether. So the last factor to measure pain and pleasure is its extent. Bentham's technique for judging communal actions is straightforward. First, we assess how each affected individual feels, whether they are happy or sad as a result of the action. Then we sum all of the happiness and subtract all of the unhappiness, and if the action increases general happiness, it benefits the community. However, if there is more unhappiness naman, then it is bad for the community. Bentham considered this vital as this method allows us to make decisions that aim to make people happier and avoid making them unhappy. Moreover, Bentham contends that it is not expected that the process be followed strictly when making moral judgments, but what we can do is keep it in mind since the closer these processes align with the said method, the more accurate they are likely to be. Lastly, Bentham argued that this approach can be applied to all forms of pleasure and pain, regardless of how they are labeled. Pleasure, whether it be called good, convenience, advantage, benefit, and so on, and pain, whether it be called evil, mischief, inconvenience, disadvantage, or loss. So in summary, Bentham encourages a methodical approach to assessing the impact of actions on individuals and society as a whole, with the ultimate objective of maximizing pleasure while minimizing pain. This technique provides a basis for making moral decisions and enacting legislation based on the utility principle, which tries to maximize the greatest good for the largest number of people. And that is all. Thank you for swimming by. Again, I am Jaleel Mata. Together with me is Zen Bangon, and this is Jeremy Bentham's An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation.